Good afternoon again. What I'm going to try to do is go over a variety of projects I'm doing right now, looking at the issues that men, particularly non-custodial fathers, are facing. But also, I have to say, my work has evolved over time. When I did a lot of work on child support and looked at non-custodial fathers, where I'm at the point now where I look at men, black men in particular. I don't really look at whether they're defined as a father, even though that could be a part of their life course. But I think there's something I've evolved to a place where I think that it's an issue about who these people are, who these men are, who are trying to be fathers, who are trying to be part of their community, who are trying to make contributions in their community and to their families. So that's why I titled this Diligent but Still Poor, Building Family and Community Economic Success. One of the things that I have been able to be privy to as a person who was a social worker before I went into academia was that I read a lot of things, and I've been either part of some of this work, either helped proofread some of this work as my chair was writing it with Irv, or I was working with it while being someone who was funded by Ron, or doing some other things. But I found that much of the material that I have used as a social worker, but also as a person who's trying to strive to be an academic, there's a lot of good stuff out there. All of it, some of it being much in a silo when I look at men, but also some of it being some of the new material, such as the latest book by Catherine Eating, looking at there is men who are very involved in their children's life, as well as the work. I'm looking very forward to the book that I just heard about today that Ron's coming out with, that's looking at the ownership of the men and who they are and what their story is going to be around their involvement. So I would highly recommend those of you who do practice work to take advantage of the many popular culture readings of the Sports Illustrated that talked about this issue, to some of the more academic work that's out there by Harvard Press, and Chicago Press, and some of the other wonderful publications that are out there. I think it's also important that for me as someone who's academic to look at what's the economic well-being of particularly black families who I tend to study. And historically, this particular information comes from the Census Bureau. But if you look at the bottom line of where black families have been since we collected data on just what is their median household income, it's the lowest of everyone's. So something's going on historically with black families that's either systemic or it's behavioral or it's both. I tend to lean more towards the systemic of some issues that are going on with black families, but we have not seen, we've seen some increases, but historically they have not done as well as most other families who are listed in this particular graph right here. One thing that we try to do, and I would commend my colleague at the Center for Family Policy and Practice, Nino, we looked at something that was done several years ago by a group called WOW, where they looked at what is the amount of money it would take for someone to live a decent life, paying their rent, having utilities paid, having food, transportation, etc. And so we decided to do one for Wisconsin. Some of you before the presentation, I gave you one that was based on the state of Tennessee. And if you want a copy of that, it's in the back on the chair that you can pick it up as you leave. And so we found that in order for a man to be able to take care of what, for some of these men, is very common, a child support order, and take care of his life, and to take care of these very basic needs, he needs to make at least $40,000 a year. At least in the state of Wisconsin, if he has 2 children and he has a child support order, which is an hourly wage of $18. And again, this is the evolving person I've become from as someone who delivers services and now is very interested in investigating what is this person we're talking about who is a non-custodial parent or an African-American male who is low income. What does he really need to be able to survive in a state like Wisconsin or any state in order to take care of himself? And right now we're saying an hourly wage of $18 is what he needs in order to be able to have a more, better idea of what economic security is like for him and for his family. And again, this is not being the person living in a household with a wife or a partner. This is just him taking care of himself and the child support order that he needs to pay on a monthly basis. Thank you. Some of the things that I've been very curious about too as a researcher is that, for example, in Wisconsin, we have one of the highest rates of incarceration for black males in the country. When I was living in the UK last semester on sabbatical, the BBC did a story on Wisconsin, and I happened to be there, and they came to me and said to me, "You're from Wisconsin, can you please tell us why you have such a high rate of incarceration of black men?" And I'm someone who does qualitative work. I don't count numbers, I don't pay the bills. My wife does because I'm not good with numbers. But I can tell you a good story. So the thing is that I was able to tell them based on what I know through my work, that when I looked at men who were owing child support, very early on in 1997, I was looking at a lot of men who were telling me I've been incarcerated for not paying their child support, which I did not even understand or didn't even believe until I saw the number of men who were being incarcerated incarcerated, at least in Wisconsin. But for Wisconsin, we have this issue, but also for these men we're talking about, incarceration is a major issue. And also for some of the things that Herb already said earlier, if you're looking at trying to give these men jobs, incarceration or previous incarceration, whether it's in jail or prison, has a major impact on their ability to be able to take care of themselves or their family. The other thing is that when you look at, and also from a comprehensive advocacy point of view, most adults are only included in the social welfare system that we're talking about vis-a-vis their custodial children. I know Ron has talked about this in many of his publications. I know that there's been talk this through even some work that Herb has done. But again, it's crucial that we have to recognize, and Jacqueline said some of this earlier on in the first session, that low-income women and children are not being provided adequate social protection, and at the same time, men are predominantly left out of the social welfare policy system. And so, very much like what Herb was saying, these men and women mirror each other. So if we're really trying to help families, we need to understand that these men need some of those same services. And some of the work that I know that Ron has been doing in New York and as well as around the country has been saying that we need to figure out how do you engage men in this work in a way that they are seen as an unequal partner because they're both poor. So public policy and social services, for me, is really important as a researcher, as a qualitative researcher. It's also really important for me to be very much up on what's going on around social welfare policy. Also, the Center for Family Policy and Practice also has a really good publication, Comprehensive Advocacy, which you can get off of their website. It speaks to some of this as well if you want to look further into some of the suggestions. Now, in terms of my own research agenda, what I really see is some of the biggest issues around this population is we need to really examine what are the housing needs of single men. I've talked to hundreds of men, and the one thing that always comes up is, I have nowhere to go. You know, when I hear recommendations being set, such as parenting time, that's well and good, but where are these men going to take their children if there's a parenting time set? The many of them are living under a bridge, in a housing shelter, with their grandma, with their mother, with their aunt, and it's all very temporary. So there really is not a really good housing policy for men who are single adults or for single adult women. So I think for me, as someone who really looks at how does this practice and this policy really work, this is something I'm very concerned about for men who are trying to maintain their own agency. Another issue is, what are the cumulative effects of child support enforcement on child well-being? I've seen a lot of research done around the financial issues of how additional financial contributions make a difference in any child's life. But what is the emotional impact over time on a family that sees their mother and father going back and forth about the child support, or seeing a parent who is really dealing with a lot of stress around a bill that he just cannot pay because it's just unrealistic based on an order that was set that is not even real. One of the areas I'm doing a lot of working with the co-investigator, Dr. James Topetsis, is we're looking at the level of trauma experienced by adult men. We are taking advantage of the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey. We are involved in a workforce development board where we're going and talking to men who are willing to be participants in our project and doing surveys with them, not just looking at their level of trauma they've been exposed to, but also what other behavioral and economic issues that have served as a possible barrier to their own ability to attain some place of well-being. I'm also involved in looking at issues of access to justice for non-custodial parents in contempt of court cases. I just was awarded a very nice NSF grant on Thursday, where I have been for the last year looking at courtrooms and listening to judges, interviewing judges, lawyers, DAs, public defenders about this issue of contempt of court for men who are going to jail for non-payment of child support. My colleague, my co-investigator with that is Professor Rita, who's a family law professor at the law school at UW. And we put our first article out for publication this year to some law journal that we're hoping to submit it to in a couple of months. And we're very excited about what we're seeing, but also we're now also interviewing men who have been incarcerated for non-payment to get a better understanding of them. And the last thing is that I think there needs to be more information about economic security across a lifetime for low-income families, and to look at their involvement with the child support enforcement system. And I thought those are the two things I want to highlight in my last 3 minutes that I have at this point. This is just an example of some of my initial data that I've been able to, I want to share with you. When I talk about levels of trauma, what does it look like when you're looking at, these are the 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction it's called. For the national study that was done in San Diego with the very first adverse childhood experience, those were the numbers that were for a primarily white population. I've been able to look at 2 different sites, one in Milwaukee and one in St. Louis, and that's the sample size, and the numbers are much higher As you can see, for example, for verbal abuse, physical abuse, and one thing that we're depending on the numbers in the day we look at this, the sexual abuse numbers are just as high as they are for the white population. We also have very significant numbers for emotional abuse. For some reason, our sample in Site 2 is very low, and we're not sure if that's an error in our testing, but we're going to check that out. We looked at physical abuse, and then for household dysfunction, if there was a mother who was exposed to who had been a victim of domestic violence, household substance, mental health, mental illness in the household, as well as parental separation of divorce and incarcerated household member, which is very high for black families. The sample size is all black men, ages of 18 to 45, who have been part of the sample. And so we're looking at how does this issues of trauma or exposure to trauma affects one's well-being and their ability to maintain a job or be in a relationship. We're very early in our analysis of this data. We just finished we have a few more focus groups to do, but we're also writing up some of our initial data right now that we will be submitting for publication as well. Another thing I want to talk about, which was one of my points, was that a publication that I helped work with the center on was what we want to give our kids, and it was the whole issue of legacy and economic security. We particularly looked at the issue of child support and what does that mean for a family across their lifetime. The reason I bring this up is because in my observations in the courtroom, I often would hear a judge say, if you want to not go to jail, if you want to pay this, if you want this person not to be there for 90 days or 6 months, I need to have a purge payment today. And I don't care who brings it in, but somebody needs to bring this money in. I hear it all the time. And that's not the grandmothers or the grandfathers or the aunts and uncles' fee. That's his fee. And if he can't pay it, ability to pay should be looked at and assessed. So when I heard Commissioner Trevetski talking this morning, I was very curious about where these states are that they are doing this. I know in the 2 states I'm at, it's an issue. I'm heading on the right time. So it means I should be stopping. I think that's important for us to look at that and examine it. These are some of the themes that we saw. If you want the publication, there's a handout in the back that you can go to look at. I guess the one thing I've already said is that relatives are ones who are jeopardizing their own economic security. Really, and these are the themes we saw. We're not saying this is definitive. For us, it is, as those of us who look at this data. But I really would challenge and really encourage other researchers to look at whether or not economic security for families is affected in some way through any of these policies that we have them going through in the social welfare system. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. We're going to hold the line in a minute and have Dr. Thompson present next. I would just ask to remind you to please fill out your